Hello, everybody. This is Steve Hargadon, and in the United States, it is May 14th, 2009. In New Zealand, it's May 15th. We have a special guest tonight, Mark Treadwell. Our session is starting late. We understand that you may have time issues and you have to leave early. Please don't feel badly about that. We are recording the session. Please feel free to come and go as you please. If this is your first time in Illuminate and you think that you might want to ask Mark a question, go up to Tools, Audio, and run the Audio Setup Wizard. You can do that right now. And just check and make sure that your microphone will work. We want to give great thanks to KnowledgeWorks for funding this interview series. They've been terrific partners. They've created a 2020 forecast that you can see, and we'll give you the link at the end of the show where you can Google KnowledgeWorks 2020 forecast. If this is your first time in Illuminate, you'll notice at the top of your screen is a green check and a red X. If you can find that, it's up in the top set of icons. If this is your first time in Illuminate, would you please click on the green check? You'll see the check shows next to my name. So the rest of us, let's clap for those first-timers in Illuminate. You've come in and you've figured it out. Mark would be putting up a green check if he weren't on the telephone, but we're on his computer. You've also got a chat area, which is down below the participant list. I actually like to move that chat around, and here's how I do that. I go up to View, Layouts, and I select Wide Layout, and that helps me to see more of the chat. You can put a message in the chat. You can actually send a private message by clicking on that drop-down box next to the Send button. But do be aware that if you send a private message, the moderator still sees it, so that's me. So just don't say anything nasty about Steve Hargadon in those messages. They don't show up in the recorded version of the chat. Okay, so this is a map of the world. I'm going to give you all permissions to modify the map. Look to the left of the map, look for a little wand with a red dot at the end. And if you click on that wand, you can place yourself on the map. And we've got mostly U.S., we've got Hawaii, we've got what looks to be northern Japan, we've got 2 in Australia, 2 in Hawaii. If I didn't identify that Asian link, would you let me know where you're from? Sapporo, Japan. Awesome. Yeah, Peggy loves that wide layout. I do too. I never use Illuminate without using that wide layout. It helps to follow the chat. Anyway, we're at 46 in the chat room. Thanks so much for being here tonight. Mark, I'd like to ask you if you would to introduce yourself. Tell us the time and temperature where you are, and maybe a little bit about your background.
Okay, that's fine. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for hanging around while we move through this process. We've been doing research. I have a research team, and we've been doing research around the future of education over the last 15 years. And in the last 3 or 4 years, we've synthesized many of those ideas. And following a paper we wrote in 1998. In 1998, we wrote the first of several papers talking about what we describe as a paradigm shift in learning and the consequences of that paradigm shift in learning across the world, and what that would mean for global systems, global social processes and institutions, and how they would affect the world as such. And the metaphor we use, or the analogy we use, is around the fact that the last paradigm shift we had in the world really was just prior to the Renaissance period. And so that's the scale of the paradigm shift we're talking about. So that's what I want to talk about today, and why that is going to transform education and learning, and what we've actually done in New Zealand around that. So I live in New Zealand. I was born in London. My parents were Irish. They immigrated to Australia when we were kids, and so I grew up in Adelaide in South Australia. So if the Australians are in South Australia, there you go. And I moved here 30 years ago to do a 3-month job, and just absolutely loved New Zealand and stayed here, and now I'm married and 2 kids. So it's about maybe 16, 17 degrees here. It's gone cool just lately here in New Zealand. This is, of course, heading into fall, okay, and autumn for those people who live in the different parts of the world. And I'll talk through a little bit now, if it's okay with you, Steve, regarding that shift and how we see that changing education and learning, and also the sort of moves that governments now around the world need to make in order to make the most of the efficiency and effectiveness gains that this paradigm shift provides or makes opportune to us. So is it okay to go with that, Steve?
Yeah, that would be great. Although I did want to ask you,
Steve?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
There's a slight lag, Mark, when you come on my telephone, so I apologize. Now, I did want to ask you, you have two daughters, right?
Okay. Yep.
So how has their education
16 and 18.
16 and 18?
How's their education been impacted?
How's their education been impacted by what you've been learning?
Well, my girls actually now present with me on several occasions now, and increasingly they're also talking from their perspective about some of the things that have changed for them and why they wish they had got those changes been available to them when they were much younger, because they are in the twilight years of their compulsory education, so they're in their final years of high school. So for them, they are really missing out on many of the transformations that are now taking place in New Zealand education, which is sad, unfortunately. One of them is heading off to train as a teacher next year, and so we'll have to try and pick up the universities and make sure they're on deck for that. But hopefully they've benefited from just the discussions we've had with them and the discussions they've had at conferences with me and the presentations they've made at conferences. That's been very cool.
So, Mark, the title of your recent book is, or one of them is, Whatever, The Revolution of School v2.0. And I think the whatever refers to how students respond when asked questions, or just sort of a generational response. Have your daughters ever said that to you?
No. I think they realize it'd be punishable with, not quite death, but something close, like you wouldn't have the car. So, no, they haven't done that to me yet.
So, Mark, there's also a dog on the cover of the book. What does that mean?
Yeah. The dog really was the epitome. I was looking for something for the epitome of whatever, and the dog really, to me, was that epitome of that. It's not our dog, so it really is just a photo, but the dog's become symbolic of that whole sort of feeling of, whatever, I'll do the bare minimum I have to do. If I've got to fetch a stick, yeah, okay, but then I'm just going to lay down again. And what we see around the world really is this disengagement factor with learners. They are chilling out, they're doing the bare minimum to get what they need to get through the system. So not even revolting against the system, they're just doing the bare minimum, so there's no aggravation. But most teachers find this even more aggravating than actually them getting angry. And I think that frustration and that disengagement is reaching epidemic proportions around the world. And no matter which country I speak in, I see evidence of it wherever I go. And all teachers understand that concept of whatever pretty much straight away. Hence the title of the book, because I want to get rid of that word.
Want to get rid of which word? Oh, the whatever, of that being a response.
Whatever. Yeah, as a response. I want kids to go, yeah, fantastic, let's get on with this. This sounds exciting. I'm fully engaged in this. That's the word, that's the sort of the approach or the sort of thing we're looking for. So that's one of the things that we're sort of trying to do. But one of the things we're trying to get, first of all, in place is a whole lot of technological stuff in the background, and then pedagogical andragogical processes for teachers to rethink through what they're doing in the classroom and what that means for practice and also for curriculum. So there's a lot of implications of the work we've done, and in New Zealand we've been working on many of those processes for the last 8 to 10 years. And so we're well down that track. We've just released a new curriculum. The total curriculum for our compulsory sector, that's K-12, is just 44 pages long, and that provides a curriculum framework for teachers then to actually turn into a localized curriculum for their school. So schools have control in New Zealand over hiring and firing, of staff. They have full control of their school budgets. So most of them are in the millions of dollars in terms of what money they get to spend on buildings or whatever they like. There's very little government processes around what should be taught and how it should be taught. It's pretty much left up to the school and the school community. So schools in New Zealand have a huge amount of autonomy, which is very unusual. And with the new curriculum, they even have autonomy around the curriculum. We have a review process that goes through schools every 3 years to check to make sure they're reaching some basic sort of standards around some issues. But generally speaking, schools have a high degree of autonomy, and it's a very high trust model.
So, Mark, I'm really curious to drill down on a couple of things. I'm going to let those who are in the session know that Mark can't see the screen. He's not actually logged on to Illuminate. So if you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. If I miss it, I'm going to count on those of you who are more seasoned in Illuminate to draw it to my attention and make sure that I see that it's up there. And you can even raise your hand if you just want to let me know there's something in the chat. Mark, so it sounds like what you're saying is that the problem is disengagement, but that disengagement maybe is a reflection of a larger change, and that because of that change and because of the resulting disengagement, that there needs to be a rethinking of teaching and learning. Is that accurate?
That is correct, yes. Yeah. So just put briefly, what we've seen in the last few years is we talk about this paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift really has been the shift from a knowledge-based centricity of learning. In other words, if you know stuff, you're a winner. So if you can remember stuff in the summative test, you win, and you go on to the next level of learning, and so forth and so forth. Through the university system and then on into whatever you might do from then on in. So knowing stuff was the be-all and end-all, and so at Trivial Pursuits nights, teachers were very popular because they know lots of stuff. And what we are sort of saying now is that really, to a large degree, the paradigm shift, that first paradigm shift was made available through the development of the printed press. And so the printing press allowed people to essentially be able to move knowledge around much more efficiently and effectively and for a much lower cost. And in the process of doing that, it meant that knowledge became much more transportable, available, etc. And what we're now seeing is a second transformation on the same scale as the invention of the book. With the invention of the internet, we're now seeing a new paradigm opening up. And with the internet, for the same reasons, we've got the lowering of the cost of knowledge and also the availability and cost of collaboration around the world, just like we're doing now. And so this next paradigm shift ushers in the same potential as the first one does. So in the first paradigm shift, those people who brought on board the capacity to use the new tool, that understand how to read and write, they could actually make the most of that technology and move forward. And I often give the example of China, who in the 12th century had a fleet of 330 ships, the longest one being 166 meters long. And given that in the 1800s most ocean-going boats were at a maximum of about 40 meters, that was a massive ship. But really, in that process between the 12 and the 1400s, China, as emperor, locked down. They sunk the whole navy. He sunk the whole navy and locked down the whole of China, fearful of this knowledge that was now being able to be transported and pushed around very quickly. And if you take another example from Portugal, from the region of what is now Portugal, the Portuguese did just the opposite. In Portugal, they went away and said, look, they moved down to look at Bombay, which was the central port there. Also, China was trading through Bombay at the same time too. And they sent a team of people down, their small team, 2 boats, landed off the coast of Bombay, spent 3 or 4 years learning from the processes they use there, the technology, things like flying money, a whole raft of technologies, the Chinese technologies which have been brought down through that region as well, brought those back, and Portugal leveraged off the back of those technologies and the printing press to actually develop a whole new community and dominated that whole European landscape for some time. And of course, Spain picked up the ideas, of course, being very close, and also England also being very close, picked up those ideas and technologies and also dominated the frontiers. So countries and governments which leverage off these new technologies can really fly with it. What we're seeing now is with the internet now is lowering the cost of knowledge dramatically, but it's doing something very interesting. It's also providing us with a whole series of environments and technologies to facilitate learning to a much deeper degree. In almost every school in the world, if I go into the library is arranged in order of, there's a volcano section, a space section, a underwater world section, famous mathematicians, Aztecs, Romans, these thematic topics. And kids didn't actually have to understand those concepts underpinning those topics. They just had to remember some of the knowledge from it because our testing systems tested the knowledge. To teach for understanding, you need to be able to interrogate rich knowledge resources, and that interrogation is driven by clever, rich, open, fertile, high-order thinking questions from the teacher. It has only been through the advent of the internet that we can actually truly resource those clever, rich, open, fertile questions. And through the internet also, we can actually then work with people from around the world on these topics. And so the internet is opening up a gateway to change the end point of learning, which traditionally, right through the last paradigm, was knowing stuff, to a new end point of understanding. And in that new end point of understanding, what we start to realize is that, in fact, through the process of inquiry, what students can do is to work with knowledge, to manipulate it, work with it, interrogate it, etc., and then actually present it in a different way, and in the process build that understanding. And so we're looking at building that understanding. That's our key now to the way forward in the 21st century. That means huge shifts in thinking for many schools and school systems. So we're moving away from the knowledge is the answer, that we just want that knowledge stuff, because we can look that up on Google if we have to. There's a baseline of knowledge you need to build the understanding. But at the moment, we're moving from the knowledge base through to understanding, rather than asking ourselves, what concepts do kids in the 21st century actually need to understand? And asking ourselves, if those are the concepts we need to understand, what knowledge underpins them? And so we're shifting from a thematic base to our curricula, and a knowledge base to our curricula, to a concept-based curriculum. And that's what we've just finished in the second large text is just been completed, is to produce this global conceptual framework for learning.
So Mark, I guess the question that I'm very much on board with most of what you're saying. But I guess the interesting question for me would be, do we sometimes overstate the case? Meaning your description of education, and I won't read the quote I have here, but I think you described it, and the impact of the computer, does that give the internet too much credit for the role? Meaning, when I graduated from college in 1983, the goal of my liberal arts education was very much what you just described, without real access to the internet.
Yeah. What the internet provides really is a way, for example, my daughter got sick a little while ago, quite sick. Now we were able to that outcome, because the outcome being presented, or the potential sort of cure that was being presented to us, was not one that we wanted to go ahead with. But because I had the capacity to go online and get the best people in the world to discuss this and come back to me with some better advice, I was able to solve a complex problem in a very short space of time with a really good outcome. And the outcome being presented at that point was not good. So what we're talking about now is it's not just the potential for that liberal arts approach and getting people to interrogate and think about what they're doing, because in fact that liberal arts education was largely available only to a small minority. What we have seen in the last 80 years is a complete transformation of the workplace. We've seen from, for example, in the United States, 80% of people worked in the primary sector just at the beginning of last century. So in the early 1900s, 80% of people worked in the primary sector. By the end of the 20th century, what we were seeing is that 80% of people were now working in the service sector. Now, Richard Florida wrote a fantastic book called The Flight of the Creative Class. That's after his first book, which is called The Rise of the Creative Class. He quickly produced a second book called The Flight of the Creative Class. And what we're seeing now is the rise of the creative class, because we're seeing some of our service industries moving offshore. Increasingly here in the United States and elsewhere, the service industries and the knowledge industries, we may describe them as, have moved offshore. And we're seeing the rise now of the creative class. Now, creativity and innovation is seen by all our countries as a way in which we can generate and improve and increase our GDP. But that creativity relies on understanding. If you just know stuff, you can't actually be creative. You've got to actually take that knowledge and develop a deep understanding of it in order to be creative and innovative. And so the transformation that we're talking about, although we had in liberal arts education for some years, especially back through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, what we've seen in many countries is a reversion back to a knowledge base, and with people really pushing the real big things of literacy and numeracy. Literacy and numeracy being absolutely everything, and literacy being only reading and writing. Okay, literacy really, if you look at in the service sector economy, the most important literacy in the service sector economy is oral language. And given that 80% of people now work in the service sector, oral language should dominate that language landscape, but it still doesn't. Reading and writing still dominates it. Now, I would suggest too, and I can send through some diagrams of this for you, that in fact in the transformation from the oral world, where oral learning, the oral stories are being passed down, oral histories passed down, oral ideas passed down, to the book paradigm, both those processes require something we refer to as synthesis. Synthesis is the ability to take ideas and add new ideas and form a greater, bigger world picture or a world view. By shifting to the book paradigm, we opened up more opportunity for more knowledge, more understanding, and a greater world view. In the shift to the internet, in this second paradigm shift we're now seeing, what we're now able to do is to actually engage in an even richer environment with real people. Rather than waiting for a book to come out, we can speak to the very people that are doing whatever it is we want to know about. So you can go onto epals.com and actually visit people around the world, and this is what schools here in New Zealand are doing. If there's a news item, rather than waiting for the newspaper to report on it, they are finding the closest classroom in EPALS. There's 270,000 schools in EPALS, the closest classroom, and going on Skype or whatever it might be to talk with those kids about their experiences, about what happened in their environment, and having a much richer and also much less filtered view of what's going on. So in Thailand recently, with the dispute there, we had a group of kids who actually got in touch with a Thai school close by, and someone there could speak English, in fact a few people there could speak English, and they had that conversation to work out what actually is going on. And it turned out that many of those people were unaware that anything was going on, because the big thing at the time was a water festival. And so that was the big news, not these disputes that we were seeing on our global networks, television networks. So it was interesting to get a different perspective on that. So I think it's more than just a small change. This is a major shift in how we build understanding and creativity in the 21st century.
So there's been a question in the chat. Kathy asks, is there a name for this paradigm shift? You're saying it's the greatest shift. I think I read that you sort of called it the second Renaissance. Is there another name that you're using for this shift?
Yeah. Yeah, what we're seeing is a shift. Prior to the first Renaissance period, and this was a regional paradigm shift because it was European-centric at the time. Prior to that period of time, prior to the Renaissance actually happening, there's a very tumultuous time as Europe got its headspace around what does this mean? Now you can learn in a different way using the book. And countries that leveraged that actually accelerated themselves from a very low status to a high status in a very short period of time in historical terms. And decisions made in that space, in that tumultuous period of time, will really dictate who will dominate the landscape when everything settles down. And after things settle down, that not just the technology of the book, but a whole lot of other social events as well, such as the Reformation, such as the landowners and the traders becoming as wealthy now as the historical aristocrats, etc. Workers demanding payment for their work. people being paid to think, so the Michelangelos, the Da Vinci's of the world were being paid to think about a whole raft of things, and we had our first researchers. All those things merged together to form a Renaissance period, a time of great change. And whenever there is a paradigm shift of this type, we go through a period, a tumultuous period, followed by a Renaissance period. And so what we're predicting in the texts and the writings we've done is we're predicting a second Renaissance period, which we've loosely described, but we're looking for a new name, as Nouvelle Compréhension, the new understanding. So Nouvelle Compréhension is this new Renaissance period which will emerge out of this, but only to countries who make the infrastructural changes to make the internet available, just like the printing presses were made available to the general public, but not until the 1800s in some contexts. But if we can make that available, those countries who make that shift and realize, in fact, learning via the internet is a much different process, because when you learn on the internet, the synthesis process is not just about text. It's much richer. We're now not dependent only on text to learn. For example, today we're all listening to this broadcast. Okay, if you were to read the book, it's 350 pages. Now I can synthesize that and compress it down into a 45-minute presentation, very briefly, and you get the idea. So that actually means you're learning faster. If you go onto a web page of the New York Times, you will learn faster, because in fact you can actually synthesize the video that's there for you to view, the audio that's there for you to view. You can look at the images that are there for you to use. You can actually communicate directly with some of the people involved as well. And so what we're now starting to see is this shift in how we learn, not just what we learn, but how we actually learn. And the third, I'll stop there for a minute until people can ask some questions maybe, then I'll go to the next phase.
Well, so those of you who have come in, like Jim Klein, and asked longer questions, unfortunately, Mark's not able to see the chat. He's on the telephone, but we're going to try and track those and get to them. I'd like to try and make a connection, Mark, and tell me if you think this is accurate. I'm looking at the list of 47 people in the chat, and a good number of them are individuals where I feel that their association with Web 2.0 has dramatically altered their personal learning and their career paths. And I know I've experienced that as well, that there has been this sort of dramatic shift, a transition or transformation that's taken place with me because of these technologies. Do you think it's fair to make a comparison between those personal shifts and the sort of this larger sense that you have of a new renaissance?
Yeah. Let's look at some of the things that have happened recently. If you look at Barack Obama's win in the election last year, he transformed his approach in terms of politics, and politics now is being transformed via these Web 2 tools. It's going from a top-down process to a collaborative process. If you look at even going to the doctor today, when I turn up at the doctor says to me, "Mark, what is wrong with you?" Because he knows I'll have gone and researched what I think is wrong with me. And it is no longer him telling me what's wrong with me. It's a collaborative deal. If you look at churches are divided themselves into two paradigms. The old paradigm of the top-down model, and those churches are dying. They really are. Unfortunately, they are dying. If you look at the churches that are booming, they're all collaborative. And they're all using these Web 2 tools. They've got a rock band up the front, and the relevancy is clear to the people who are attending. There must be, because there's tens of thousands of these people attending these new churches. Every single system that we see now is making a choice between a top-down model, which is dying, and a collaborative model, which is booming. Businesses now are collaborating. Collaboration now is the number one focus of most businesses, getting the best possible outcome from the workers in the field. Not telling them what to do, but asking them for their opinion, asking them to contribute to the overall functionality of that business. And so Web 2 tools are deeply embedded in this collaborative process. We require them to do that process. And so it's not just the stuff on the internet. Okay, the stuff there is important, but really it's also the ability to then have discourse around that stuff to build the understanding using experts like we're doing today.
So I want to move on so that we can get to the Q&A. I want to make a connection here. So you basically described this change, and so the next step then would be what do we do with schools? And I'm going to quote from your book. The key goal for schools, therefore, is to expose young people to as many different opportunities as is possible so they can discover for themselves what they're inherently good at, what they would do even if they were told not to do it, what they are passionate about. So you've described what's happening in New Zealand. I think a lot of us in the United States would say, we're not sure this can come in through the front door. I interviewed Michael Horn from Disrupting Class, and the basic thesis is this kind of disruptive transformation won't happen easily, or maybe almost can't happen from the top-down current model. How do you respond to that?
I would tend to agree, and that's why I think in New Zealand, with the fact that each of our schools are autonomous and there's a high-trust model, they can bring in through the front door. But one of the other things we have realized in this curriculum is this is the first we call competency-based curriculum. Now, in the late 90s, early 2000, two big reports came out in Europe. One was from the OECD called the FICO report, and one was from the European Commission called the Eredice report. Both these reports investigated what capacities does anyone require in order to become a learner. And they came up with these 7 competencies, which in New Zealand we've distilled down to 5 competencies. And the 5 competencies are managing self, thinking, participating, communicating, and collaborating. Unless you've got those 5 competencies, you can't really engage in the learning process. And this is where we're seeing the problem with the children in classrooms at the moment, just disengaging, because they do not have the skill sets for managing self, thinking, participating, communicating, collaborating. And we need to actually teach those skill sets in order to actually get them engaged. In other words, it's not just about maths, English, and science. It's now about saying we've got to teach kids to manage not just their, bring a pen and bring a book, but manage their futures, manage their learning, manage their emotions. In terms of thinking, we've got to ask ourselves, how does the brain actually work? Because our model we have at the moment is fundamentally flawed. It really is. There's no such thing as right and left brain thinking. You can't see pictures in your head. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there which is what people take as common knowledge, but in fact is very, very poorly based on sort of anecdotal evidence and just local gossip that's permeated through the education sector. So we have to have a much better understanding of how the brain works, and that's been our last 4 years of work has been around how the brain works, and I've just been stunned actually now by realizing, for example, Einstein has the lowest ratio of neurons of any human being we have on record. Okay, so that fundamentally tells me we've got an issue here. And so the new book I'm just working on at the moment, the 4th in the series, is called Whatever, Were We Thinking? And we unpack these new models of how we think the brain now works. And it's a totally different ballgame altogether. And it moves away from that static model of the brain is this when you're born and that's just it, that's your lot. And it moves to a much more dynamic model. And what we're now starting to see is we can now understand things like autism. We can understand where savant behavior comes from and why that happens. We can understand some of the disengagement we now see in the classroom using this new model. And I'll present that at the International Thinking Conference in Kuala Lumpur in a month's time, the results from that work. So we're now starting to use that whole idea of what thinking actually is, teaching people to think. Because you can't just say to kids, come on, think. Because what are they supposed to do? I mean, they put their hand above their eyebrow and they sort of put their hand on their hip, the other hand on their hip, and that's what you do when you think. But what are you supposed to do? When someone says use your imagination, what actually do you want them to do? Like, how do you use your imagination? We need to be much more explicit around these things because, in fact, if we want people to learn and interrogate, they must have those competencies in place prior to the learning process. So in the second text, we outline what those concepts are that underpin those competencies and map them across the year levels.
So I want to make sure that I send you the chat log so you can see the great chat that's going on. And I'm going to open up in a minute to questions because I think we've got a group here that has a lot of good questions. You helped me to see something, and I'm curious to see if the group would agree with this. I've been I've had a hard time understanding the role of technology as it relates to education. But what I think I've heard is that the role of technology in our culture as a whole is so dramatically changing our culture that it's going to require new things of our educational system, which is a better understanding for me of the driving force of technology. Not that the technology itself is changing educational practice, but its cultural impact is requiring that we focus on ways of teaching that better suit and prepare our students for that world. Chat group, do you think that's appropriate? And Mark, how do you respond to that?
I'd say that's very appropriate. The technology itself should be transparent. It's not about the technology. It's not about boxes on desk. The more transparent the technology can be, the better. To me, the iPhone is the point at which we're at the moment. It's a device that allows me to contact anyone, anywhere, anytime. It allows me to see stuff in all sorts of media formats. It allows me to store information and pass information on easily and effectively and efficiently. And it doesn't come with a manual. It's relatively cheap, and it provides me that gateway. So to me, it's the ultimate sort of transparent gadget. It just slips into my pocket, and when I need it, I can access it. It runs on a battery, and the battery lasts for most of the day. So we're shifting from this sort of notion that the technology needs to be big and ugly and grey and boring to actually the technology is quite sexy, transparent, and effective and efficient, and increasingly more cost-effective. And so it's actually, as you mentioned, it's that cultural shift of what we believe is worth teaching and learning. In other words, our children entering in today, we've got no idea what they're going to need to know in 20 years' time, or 5 years' time for that matter. But we have to create them for that. We have to actually give them the skill set to be able to become lifelong learners. And if we simply have a top-down model teaching stuff at kids, they're never going to leave school with the capacity to continue the learning process. And with the rate at which knowledge is transforming, we all have to become now lifelong learners. So in New Zealand, our central mission in our curriculum is we have to be confident. That confidence gives the capacity to be connected. The confidence and connectivity gives us the capacity to be actively engaged. And those three things give us the capacity to become lifelong learners. And that is our focus. And so the competencies provide the bedrock of one of the pillars to that process. And in the other pillar that we now require, and this is a very interesting one, and it's come into lots of debate here, but it now is very well accepted, is the fact that if we then give people the capacity to be creative, we can be creative for good or for ill. And so in order to actually give our kids the capacity to be creative, we also have to provide them with a baseline of principles and character formation processes as well. So in other words, the two pillars that hold up this thing now are the competencies and the character and principle formation. In the center is that capacity, and I'll send you this diagram and post it on the site somewhere. In the center of the diagram is this whole idea of building knowledge into understanding through clever questioning and inquiry learning, and then applying the imagination to that understanding to be creative and innovative. And that requires a rich information and collaborative Web 2 style environment to do that.
Okay, so for those of you who've come in late, we are running about a half an hour behind. Mark was gracious enough to call in on a phone line to get past some of the computer hurdles he was having. If you need to leave, please don't feel badly about this. The session is being taped, recorded, and we will publish that later tonight so you have access to it. Why don't we shift gears toward the Q&A? And if you've posted a good question, I apologize. This chat's been going by so fast that I haven't been able to grab them all. But I think there were some questions around assessment. And certainly if you have a question you want to ask using the microphone, you can raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon with the green up arrow, or you can put your question in the chat. Okay, so T. Gilly says, give us an example of applying the rich integration of knowledge and creativity.
An example in terms of what would happen in a school?
I think that must be the case.
Okay. In the school environment, at the moment, we are particularly focusing on the knowledge, and the assessment, and you mentioned the issue of assessment, has been around what did the child remember in that test. What we're shifting to now is giving kids bigger questions that ask them to compare, contrast, investigate, interrogate, etc. And we're asking them to go away and work in teams to come back with possible solutions to that using an inquiry methodology. What the inquiry methodology does is allow the kids the time and space to build understanding through that interrogation and their own investigation of knowledge bases and collaborative environments around the world. What we're now seeing, therefore, is if you build understanding, the assessment system fundamentally shifts. First of all, you do need summative testing because there's a body of knowledge that underpins that understanding, and you do need to build that body of knowledge and have that in order to build the understanding. So we still require summative testing. But also we need diagnostic testing and formative testing because we need to be able to actually guide the child in terms of where they're at and what they need to do to get to where they need to be. So we have built in New Zealand something called ASTL, the Assessment for Teaching and Learning process. And in that assessment and teaching and learning process, what we're trying to produce there is the process of being able to get the child to go and actually test themselves to see where they're up to, but also formatively giving them a guide to where they might go to next. The fourth element in the assessment schedule is something that we've been building up at a software company as well in my spare time, and one of the things that we've been building within that business is the reflective online portfolios. So kids can now go online, and teachers have set up, and my girls have been doing this now for a couple of years, and they reflect on their own competencies. In other words, we can't give a child a B for thinking, or 73% for participating and contributing. It just doesn't make any sense. So what we have to do is get the kids to reflect on that themselves. And what has happened in that process is they've actually started to take ownership of that learning process. And Danielle my oldest daughter, gave a very good presentation at the Principals Conference just recently. And she basically implored them, saying, look, if I had only known this 5 or 6 years ago, it would have made a huge difference to my learning processes. I now understand how I learn. And because of that, I know how to learn better. And so she's sort of imploring them to actually get on with this and get it going. And this is a central tenet of the New Zealand curriculum. So how it looks in the classroom is quite different to what we've had in the past. We need access in the classroom to these rich environments. Not everybody necessarily having a laptop, because laptops are very bulky, heavy, expensive, etc. But there needs to be technology in there so they can access these gateways and also have access at home. And supportability of access obviously is another issue there as well. In New Zealand, we've also just passed legislation through our Parliament, and we're about to spend a number of billions of dollars to make sure that every home in New Zealand has access to fibre. So we'll have gigabit connections to every school in New Zealand within 3 years. That's the only money we've spent on this in trying to sort of get over this recession we're now in. But the recession itself is just part of that tumultuous period as we re-engineer our thinking around how we move money around. And it's the movement of money via the internet that caused the problem we're in at the moment, by one shape or another. So it is changing. It is changing significantly. And the opportunities now for what we can do with the teaching and learning environment are just massive. And there's never been a better time to really be an educator.
So, Mark, I don't know if you can see, are you seeing the questions I'm putting into Skype from the chat?
Okay, I'll just read them, so then I'll answer them. How do you see this moving rapidly into the shift when we are burdened with the administration who has no idea of its importance? You have to be strategic. About 12 or 13 years ago, 5 of us met who were fairly influential here in New Zealand education, and none of us worked in our Department of Education. We're all external to that. And we met and decided to start lobbying 10 key people in the department. And for 3 years, that went nowhere. But suddenly, 5 of those 10 people got together one afternoon, and they started talking about this paradigm shift, and suddenly went and made a whole lot of key decisions to actually transform the environment. So things like learning management systems became the thing that schools had to do. Interoperability of systems in schools became very important. The new curriculum got instigated. New policy practices and profile status came out as well. So what happened was lobbying. Okay, people used to say, I used to say, one day we'll get a good minister or head of education in our country. Okay, and the truth is that's probably never going to happen. Sadly, it's probably never going to happen. But we can influence that process. So we decided we would start influencing that process and influencing the minister and all the key people who were making strategic decisions around education. And that turned out to be a very, very strategic decision, and it made a huge difference to this country, that's for sure. There's another one here from Kathy. The Renaissance was a transition from the Dark Ages into explosion of the arts. Is Mark making this type of connection with the Renaissance? Has it happened already, or is it coming? Yes, I am making this connection, actually, Kathy. I'm saying that, in fact, what is happening now with creativity is now the central capacity-building tool we need for our countries. And if you graph the number of people in the creative industry, and the creative industries is across not just the arts, it's not just a bunch of singing, dancing Irishmen, but it's right across the sciences, the technologies, every single aspect. If you graph the creative growth, and this is what Richard Florida's done in his works, against GDP, you'll see it's a straight line. In other words, the more countries have invested into the creative elements of their economy, the greater their GDP has become. So I'm saying, yes, we're looking for an explosion. Has it come? No, because we're in the tumultuous period just leading into this curve, of this sigmoid curve, for this second paradigm. And so what we're looking for now is education systems that value creativity. Because in the past, we've done just the opposite. Schools have actually limited the creativity and wanted everyone to be the same. And now we're saying, no, that's not the case. And in New Zealand, we're really pushing that big time here. So has it happened? It is about to happen. We see the genesis of it here in New Zealand already. And we're seeing schools now rethinking about what subjects they should do. The only subjects my children had to do at school was drama. And it was a fantastic choice. The drama, to me, usurped science, maths, and English by a country mile. It was much more important in terms of my girls' growth and development from my perspective. Jim Klein, both teachers and students need to take back ownership of their own learning. Great point, indeed. The only way we're going to get teachers on board with this is when teachers become lifelong learners to begin with. That's the model we need. Then they can start teaching students how to be lifelong learners as well. That is absolutely critical. Jim, again, with the rise of lightweight devices that make computing as cheap, reliable, and long-lasting as cell phones, what sort of renaissance might that create? The renaissance will just mean that the connectivity we will have will just be fantastic. It won't be expensive, and the cost of connectivity now and collaboration is dropping dramatically. And we're constantly forming groups of people around the world to discuss various issues, and it can happen in a moment. And so that's very, very important in terms of developing that capacity building capability. Melissa, local governments should require school board members to grow professionally by participating in some of these online sessions. Yep, absolutely agree. You have to start and get people thinking around what really matters in terms of education. At the moment, the simplistic testing, no child left behind, or as we call it in New Zealand, every child left behind equally, is really not a solution to anything. Because in fact in our workplaces and our social places, it's the literacy in terms of the oral language, the visual language, the multimedia, and writing and reading. Those two things, all those combine to form the baseline of actually working and living and growing and being creative in our societies. Okay, thanks for explaining. Okay, thanks, Kathy. Yes, through standardized tests, indeed. It'd be easier for school board members to get hold of the archive session and have a conversation with them. Absolutely. I do a certain amount of travelling, but I can't be everywhere every time. And so one of the things is putting these resources together. So what is happening here has been fantastic. And Steve's work in terms of putting this online, I'm just going, it's fantastic. I'm not looking to capitalize on this, in terms of store it and hide it and sell it to everybody. Really, we want to get it out there so that everybody understands the process. And in New Zealand, we're just beginning that. We have a new curriculum which is being implemented at the moment that resonates around this whole process. We've built a whole lot of interoperability standards into the online environments we're now using. We've now thrown out Microsoft Office out the door, so we've no longer got that hanging over our heads. That's not the big deal anymore. It's about using these online tools in online environments to communicate and provide parents with good data about their students. At DataView, the company, our software company, we've just created something called Smart Ask, which you have to say very carefully. And Smart Ask is a bit of software that allows parents access in a dynamic way, 24/7, to their child's reflections, their tests that they're doing at school, the tests that they're selecting to do themselves, and it's a much more dynamic assessment environment because it deals with not just the summative but also the formative, diagnostic, and the reflective. And to me, what my children write about their subjects and about their competencies is just hugely insightful and wonderful to read, and it gets them to take control of their own learning. Yes, every child matters. That's a much better. Yes, every child matters. Yes, the British model. Very good. Thank you, Peggy. V2.0 school. Okay. Is the renaissance happening because of the digital native, digital immigrant phenomena? Can I ask people to not promote this digital immigrant, digital native phenomena? I've had this argument with Mark Prensky at several conferences now, and it's just a non-issue. It's a non-issue because what we're now seeing around the world is that the children are nowhere near as digitally literate as we think. In a recent survey of 4,500 secondary schools students, we discovered that 17 actually knew how to take their cell phone, take a video, and upload it to YouTube. But 98% of the students knew someone who could do that. Okay? So the capacity, the actual technological capacity of the students is fairly poor. They've jumped over the chasm and are sitting in this new paradigm, but they are not progressing up this paradigm or really making use of its effectiveness and efficiency gains because what they haven't done yet is actually learn how to learn with that technology. Teachers are looking across that paradigm because they were the masters of the previous paradigm. Their status was embedded in the first paradigm shift. So they're looking across the paradigm and they're seeing these group of kids staring back at them, smiling with all this technology, and they're overwhelmed by this, and they're thinking, goodness me, I can't possibly do this as an educator because I don't know this technology stuff. My argument is, and it's a moral ethic, and moral and ethical dilemma, is that we have to have teachers jump this paradigm, jump the chasm that separates these two paradigms, to actually teach the children how to learn with this technology. So we as educators have the capacity and know how to learn. Students have some technological capacity, but it's pretty limited. Most don't know what Bluetooth is on their phone, and most struggle to do the sorts of things we're doing right now. But we need to show them how to do that, how to use this technology for building collaborative environments and building knowledge and interrogating that knowledge to build understanding and using that understanding to be creative and innovative. That's a long question there. Yet right to play with technology, not learn with it. Okay, sometimes there's no such thing as a digital native. No, there isn't. The reality is that kids are not more familiar with technology as a result of proximity to it. They possess a complete lack of fear, a willingness to try, fail, and try again, to innovate, explore, and discover. I agree fully, Jim, but the digital native, their digital capacity from a technological perspective is much lower than we think, much lower than we imagine. And I've been surprised by just how little these kids actually know about the technology they actually do possess already.
Mark, can I ask a question?
We just took a survey of school. No. Yes.
So this raises a point for me which is fairly intriguing because my own children have different capacities or interests in the knowledge that's available from the internet. But clearly, it's much easier for them to become, or much easier for them to drill down and get information from the internet. And I find that two of them do it quite extensively. So I think to some degree, just having access to the technology, while they may not be better capable of it, they do use it. But I'm wondering about, in terms of population, we talk about creating an environment in which every student can have the opportunity to learn what engages them and to work. Is it realistic? Is that actually a realistic notion, knowing that people are very different, and there may be a group of students for whom this doesn't engage them, and they're not really actually interested in being engaged? The person who's going to become the park ranger.
I would say that. Yeah, look, absolutely. The park ranger will need the technology too, unfortunately. But what we're saying here too is that in the past, we've only had a few people know what was going on. and had the capacity to understand how to learn. It was a very, very small sliver, and they told everybody else what to do. What we now have is the capacity to teach far more people, not necessarily everybody, but far more people, possibly 60, 70% of people who need this new capacity, because in fact collaboration is a key part to their job and their inclusion in society. And I would argue it's probably even higher than 70%, but I'm certainly not proposing for a moment that it will be 100%. But at the moment we've got the balance around the wrong way. 5% of people are telling everybody else what to do because they were bright enough from a cognitive perspective to pick up the nuance, the modeling that they saw, and turn that into an understanding of how to learn. And they learnt that by trial and error and, the most complicated process possible. But they learnt it because they're bright enough. But that was only 5%. We now need 75% of people to understand how to learn in order to be collaborative and actually work in their environment and actually have fulfilling, creative jobs. I mean, there was a time when we all used to do hobbies because we'd arrive home from a depressing, mind-numbing job which didn't engage us in any way, shape or form, and we'd do hobbies to sort of stimulate that human desire for creativity. Now we arrive home from work and we watch a screen because we're completely over doing anything creative because we've been creating stuff all day and it's trained us mentally, and we've hardly got the energy to actually interact with our own children. And so it's actually getting that balance between these two things. More questions coming in. We took a survey, okay. Yeah, the technology is more than just a social tool. Kids use it as a social tool, and they're doing their Bebo and their MySpace thing, and they're downloading music, but they're not actually using it to learn effectively. They still are not familiar with how to interrogate, manipulate, and work with information to build understanding. Because what they need to do is the same thing that we need to do as educators, and that is learn to ask ourselves clever, rich, open, fertile questions, which push us into that whole sort of mystique and intrigue about the world we live in. And so one of our competencies in the new curriculum, one of the dispositions we're looking at in our new curriculum is this wonderment and awe. Wonderment and awe actually drives, how should we do this? Okay. And this is another question here from Mary Arnold. Are there many people who do not have technology at all? And the answer is yes, there is. There is some people, but increasingly even our lower decile or our lower achieving areas of New Zealand, the technology is creeping into the household in terms of internet, because in fact you need internet now to play your online games. So the very technology that is used for gaming, it's like a wooden horse, the proverbial wooden horse that's wheeled in, and sitting inside of that device, whether it be a PlayStation, whatever it might be, is a learning tool, a fantastically powerful learning tool. And if we give the right questions and engage the young people, they will also be intrigued by this learning tool as much as they are the games that they're playing on that same machine. It's not surprising they work in learning environments where there are controls in place that don't encourage the fundamental knowledge of the technologies. Knowledge of the technology should be easy enough to use without a manual. My guideline is that if you need to teach the program, then the program is fundamentally flawed. Most of the programs the kids are picking up and running with now, like MySpace and Bebo and downloading stuff and music and iTunes, etc., don't come with a manual. They're intuitive and you can work it out pretty quickly. And you can work it out even better and far more faster in a collaborative environment where kids get together and talk to each other. So the technology we have to use must be intuitive. And what I don't want to see is technology lessons in school. Really, we introduce them to the technology, and they should be able to actually work it out how to use it pretty much intuitively. The lessons that are required to teach them how to use that technology to learn much more efficiently and effectively, because that's what this internet paradigm gives to us, is a way of teaching more effectively and more efficiently. I'll pause for a minute.
So, Mark, I think we'll take one or two more questions and we'll kind of wrap things up. I'm going to put a link in the chat for those who were there to the survey for tonight's show. We do appreciate if you fill it out. I'll also pull it up as a web tour for those of you who are in the Illuminate session. Mark, so part of what I've heard you say is that this is about a huge historic change, that it needs to, and we need to allow it to drive a change in the way that teaching and learning take place. But this is not about bringing technology into schools to create that change. It's about changing our principles of teaching and learning and then using appropriate technologies. Have I summarized that accurately?
Correct. Yes, you have. The teaching and learning drives what technologies you will need. Bringing technology per se into the school won't solve anything because we'll just use the technology to do the same thing we've always done. So it is a fundamental sociological shift around how we view learning and how we see learning as being important in the lives of everyone in our community. So what we've talked about today is not just for the compulsory education sector. The same all applies to every single sector, the tertiary sector, our universities and polytechs and the like around the world, but also our workplace sectors. Because in fact we can't keep sending off people to very expensive, week-long learning sessions somewhere in Phoenix, and then bringing that knowledge back and having to send the next worker and the next worker. What we have to be able to do is leverage the sort of technologies we're using today, even at a very simplistic level, we need this with the telephone, to actually build learning communities. And because every business now, if it does not learning, it is not changing. If it's not changing, it's not facing up to the changing world we're living in on a day-to-day basis. And so we have to give them, young people, the capacity to become these lifelong learners using these tools. But the tools must be transparent.
So, Mark, what advice would you give an educator who's in a system that doesn't seem to be recognizing that? And if the temptation is to bring in the tools because that just is doing something, is there a better course of action for an educator in that circumstance?
There are two tiers of action that every educator has to take. Well, one is that we're fantastic as educators at subverting the system to our own ends. Once you start to get a grasp of what the potential is, then we can subvert the environment we're in to do the things we need to do and still actually get through the test. I would argue that if you teach kids to understand that they'll do that test, even though it's a low-level summative testing system, they'll do that even better still because they're engaged and they want to be there. And so it's the engagement factor we've got to leverage off here. So I don't think anyone is going to actually lose out anywhere by actually subverting the system a bit. So the subverting the system is the one tier. The second tier is that you have to be strategic. You have to get hold of your district superintendents and these people and send them books to read. You know, this is what we did here in New Zealand. I sent people books. My 3 people I had to look after in our Department of Education, I sent them books to read. I took them out to breakfast. I took them to conferences that I thought was worthwhile. You actually have to invest in these people and to develop their learning capacity because many of these people sit outside the Web 2 world. And you've got to bring them into the Web 2 world slowly but surely, giving them judicious sort of encouragement and technologies that work. And so by giving them a technology that works, giving them an iPod to play around with, I have never seen anyone not enjoy that device. My mother's got one, she loves it, okay? And she's in her late 70s now, thinks it's the best thing going. She can listen to music, she can download stuff, browse the web, make phone calls. It's a great device. So there's 2 tiers. There's the in the United States, there's a local superintendent level, there's a state level, and then there's actually, of course, a congressional, national level you've got as well. You've got to work with. Multiple tiers makes it more difficult, but that's life. In New Zealand, we're a small country. I see our Prime Minister quite regularly to airports and can chat with him. We can ring people up. That's more problematic as the system gets more bureaucratic. But that doesn't mean it cannot be done.
Mark, did you see the question I've asked you and that came from LD? What are the top 3 books that people should recommend their administrative leaders read?
You can go on to one of our websites, the Emergent 21st Century Teacher, and that's www.i-learnt.com. And on the front page, you'll see there's a professional learning book list. Now, if you click on that button, you'll see that the first book in the list is actually my book, because it's my website, so I can do this. But underneath there, you see there's 19 other books that we encourage people to pick up. And some of them, fantastic. Jacqueline Grenham Brooks, in search of understanding the case for constructivist classrooms. Howard Gardner, 5 Minds to the Future, a fantastic text. Then you've got things like Jeff Hawkins and Sandra Blakesley, once again from the United States, on intelligence. You know, they were the first neuroscience sort of group. Jeff, of course, developed the Palm Pilot and a whole bunch of other technologies, but his interest in how he developed those tools was through his interest in neuroscience. Dennis Littke, The Big Picture, Education's Everyone's Business. Michael Fullen, Breakthrough. You know, there's a whole raft of books. Catching the Knowledge Wave, Jane Gilbert, Wikonomics, even, you know, from Don Tapscott. It makes us look at these things differently. And so there's a range of about 20 books we recommend in that list there, which you can pick up and have a look at.
Okay. Mark, you've been a trooper tonight, or this morning for you. You've powered through a difficult computer circumstance. You've come on by a phone. I've put the links to the reading list and to the website in the chat, and also on the web page are good links for you. I want to thank KnowledgeWorks and Illuminate for providing support for these shows. Coming up, Susan, on this Tuesday, a special show. Susan Patrick from INACOL, North American Council on Online Learning, and Dr. Thomas Cook from the World Health Organization are going to talk about education continuity and online learning as it relates to pandemics and other circumstances in which learning needs to continue. Gary Putland coming up from Australia, Michael Wesch, Chris Deedy, John Seeley Brown, and David Thornburg. And also a virtual school series coming up with Chris Walsh, where we're going to talk to people who are doing virtual schooling. Mark, any final words before we clap for you and let you know how much we appreciate you?
Look, I think this is the most exciting time ever to be an educator. I mean, the last time we had change on this scale was 500 years ago, and it was limited to a region called Europe. Today it's a global macro paradigm shift, and the impact is going to be huge. The decisions your countries and governments make in the next 3 or 4 years will define your future as a country. And in New Zealand, we've certainly made some very, very good decisions around that in the last 2 or 3 years, and going back 10 years for some of the research work that's all been done back then. And I'm confident that, you know, as far as New Zealand is concerned, we are the Portugal of the 21st century. What we do not want to be is the China in the 21st century. Now, I'm going back to the previous discussion about the sinking the boats and hiding behind a closed wall. But I do have some fears for the United States, the increasing paranoia around simple testing and that being a guideline to good learning is a very, very scary prospect. And Australia is sinking into that same mire at the moment. Britain did the same thing. Britain was on a very good course for quite some time, and 3 years ago lost the plot and went back to the basics. And I sort of make the point to people that no one wants to go back to basics. You know, everyone wants actually to look forward to the future. No one wants to go backwards. But we're going backwards to find solutions for the 21st century, and we can't. We must look forwards to solutions for the 21st century. And I'd encourage you all out there to propel this change, to talk about it, encourage it, and use the resources we've got online at the number of websites, etc., to build capacity in your own local communities. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, we're clapping. We're clapping for you.
Thank you.
Hey, Mark, what's your Twitter account? Because apparently people have been signing up for your Twitter all during the session.
Look, I get so much mail, I just cannot deal with Twitter as well. I went on Twitter and I just got overwhelmed with it, and I couldn't cope.
So that explains why
my mail address. Yeah, exactly. My mail address is mark@work.co.nz, and I do answer mail. It's the one thing I do keep on top. We've got some systems here. I talk to my computer here, and I can actually answer lots and lots of mail in a very short space of time. I just found with my travelling and the research and the stuff I'm doing with departments around the world, etc., I just couldn't Twitter as well. So I had to actually fold my account, unfortunately. I was not doing it justice.
Well, that's understood from a fellow, I should say I frequently have to confess that I only use Twitter for my own announcement purposes. Mark, thank you so much. There was a lot of clapping you couldn't see, but you did a great job. Hope the telephone call didn't cost you too much. Greatly appreciative of it, and we will look forward to future conversations.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, all the best to you. Cheers, mate. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.